Okay, Salamat everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza, and I would like to welcome you all to this exciting conversation I am having with our guest, Professor Ilan Pappe. Today's session is titled The Ongoing Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, the century-long Palestinian struggle against the Zionist settler colonial project. This national webinar is hosted by Palestine Justice Movement Sydney and endorsed by other organizations across this continent and Aotearoa. Before I introduce our guest, Professor Ilan Pappe, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're all dialing in today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. Acknowledging that we're all dialing in from ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 230 years ago, but its echoes still reverberate to our day. I am dialing in from Camaragal country. Again, I would like to welcome everyone who is joining us today, and I must direct that welcome also to those who are joining us from the dark side, and in particular to those guests, I should say, that all opinions expressed by myself today represent my own personal views as a Palestinian from Gaza who happened to live on this colony and who happened to have his family enduring the past 20 months of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And anything I say should not be construed or misconstrued as me using any authority or agency bestowed upon me as part of my workplace. Again, I am beyond delighted and honored to be in the company of the Professor Ilan Pappe. For those who don't know Professor Ilan Pappe, or I must say, for those who have been living under a rock for the past, many years, no offense, Professor Ilan Pappe is a Jewish historian and a political scientist and a professor at the University of Exeter. He is a former senior lecturer in political science at the University of Haifa, author of The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, and lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic, alongside many other books on Palestine-Israel conflict. I can read the full bio of Professor Ilan Pappe, but that would mean we won't have the time to converse with him for the next 2 hours. So Professor Ilan, welcome to the conversation, and thank you so much for joining me all the way from the UK.
Thank you, Ahmed. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Pleasure is all mine, absolutely. So I want to dig deeper into, I know your time is limited, so I want to dig deeper straight into the conversation. But Professor Ilan, before we delve into the conversation, I must get your brief reaction on, the recent events in Palestine, in Gaza, and the surrounding region, the Israeli and American aggression against Iran and, possible repercussions on the region. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Is it only Netanyahu's dream coming true, undermining Iran, or is it that Israel collectively is fighting a war of liberation of some sort, as some analysts observe, in Gaza, in Palestine, in Syria, and now in Iran? So what are your brief thoughts on what's happening?
Well, I think that the main trigger for what we have seen in the last 12 days is first and foremost Netanyahu's own predicaments, whether it is the fact that he has reached in his trial the stage where he is now questioned by the prosecution, a chapter in his trial that he was very kind of worried about, whether it is the fact that he finds it more difficult than ever before for totally domestic Jewish-Israeli reasons to hold his government together, given also the fact that the last phase of the Israeli genocide in Gaza began for the first time, it was too late and too little, but nonetheless began to resonate as unacceptable even by some politicians in the West, changing the conversation about it, talking more openly about sanctions and so on. So a distraction was needed there as well. So that's the main trigger, namely his own personal survival, that he likes to present as the survival of Israel. But it's, first of all, it's his own political survival. But we also have to remember who are his allies ever since November 2022. And this is a bunch of Messianic Jews, Zionists, one should not say even Jews, the Messianic Zionists, who have allies among the Messianic Zionists, among the Christian fundamentalists in the United States, who share this lunatic idea that the more explosive the situation is, the more it creates historical conditions for transforming dramatically a reality into a much better reality from their perspective. And a much better reality from their perspective, and these are Netanyahu's allies, is to have a greater Israel that extends even beyond the borders of historical Palestine into the south of Syria, the south of Lebanon, maybe even into Jordan. And they have this vision of the old biblical kingdom of Solomon that they have read about in the Old Testament, that was feared by the region as a whole. Everybody deferred to it, was either intimidated by it or wanted good relationship with it. It's a whole lunatic vision, but one that should be taken seriously, because these people have at least in a modest count 90 warheads, nuclear warheads, a very strong air force, and similar unsavory allies in the White House. So we can sort of ridicule the vision, but not their ability to create a lot of carnage on the way to attempt to implement it. I don't think they would succeed. But I think what we've seen, with all these issues, what always worries me, and that's my last sentence on this, is not so much what one can easily provide a clear analysis why what happened in the last 12 days happened. What really worries is how come, reasonable Western politicians, reasonable Western journalists don't see it. How come they really sort of accept this narrative? This is Israel's self-defense. Iran was about to produce a bomb, as if they've forgotten about what happened in 2003 when they fabricated evidence about Iraq in order to attack it. This is the worrying part. It's like this famous, I don't remember who was the famous person who said it. Evil happens not only when evil people exist, but when good people do not stop them. And I think that's my main take on this last 12 days. I understand the actors in the game. I don't understand the behavior of those who can change that kind of scenario from unfolding.
It's a question that is boggling everyone. The scenario we're seeing in front of eyes play out the exact same way as it was playing, like you mentioned, in 2003, invasion of Iraq. And, the more we progress into the future, I think we can form an insight into why has it that level of indoctrination or manufacturing consent reached that level of, blinding the media and the experts and the analysts about seeing the true nature. But so thanks for that insight. I cannot be talking to Professor Ilan Pappe without discussing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the Nakba in 1948. I'm really excited to be in conversation with you for a number of reasons, but because I just mentioned to you that I just finished reading your recent book, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic. And, I couldn't leave a question I have about your book unasked. So here we go. At the beginning of your book, you are proposing a riddle, that the content of your book will attempt to solve. That is, and I want to quote that. Why does Israel invest vast amounts in two major lobbies, the Christian and Jewish, on both sides of the Atlantic? And why does this Jewish state still crave recognition of its legitimacy in the West? And I want to continue, put it differently, you continue. Why do Israel's elites still think its legitimacy is up for debate, despite the arms deals, the economic aid, the unconditional diplomatic support, that's the end of the quote. So, I mean, we have been hearing this statement more and more by proponents of the state of Israel recently over the past 2 years. Israel has the right to exist, and if you question that, you're an anti-Semite, 78 years after the establishment of the state of Israel. So I can't help but wondering, have you managed to solve that riddle? Like, what's your conclusion? I know the answer to this question might take hours, but I mean, if you can give us an insight.
Well, as you know, I wrote a 500-page book to try and answer the riddle. So definitely would be a partial answer and not a complete one. That's for sure. I think that either some of the Israeli leaders in the past, maybe still some of the Israeli Jewish politicians and elite in the present, and definitely Israel's most loyal allies in the West, deep down understand that there is really a fundamental issue with the whole idea of Zionism in Israel, and that the success of Israel to exist, if you want, to have the achievement that it has, was obtained and is obtained by force and not by legitimacy. And that troubles them. And maybe, that's what I'm trying to say in the book as well, some of them do not believe in their own explanation for why Israel's legitimacy is questioned. As you know, the official Israeli line, as you mentioned yourself, is, well, the world is still anti-Semitic, and that's why it would not allow the Jews to have a state. This is the main line. But it doesn't fit the history of the last 78 years. I mean, those who struggle against Israel, whether through an armed struggle, through diplomacy, through solidarity movements of civil societies, did not start the struggle in the question, we are struggling with something illegitimate. That was not what happened. What happened was that the project, that probably because of its problems of legitimacy, was built by force, maintained by force, and by force, once you unpack the word force, it means the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, the genocide now of the Palestinians, maybe even, not maybe, and also the more incremental daily abuses of the Palestinians. It doesn't all have to be dramatic like the Nakba or what we see in Gaza today, but in between, this daily basic abuse, daily abuse of the basic civil and human rights of the Palestinians, wherever they are under Israeli direct rule or indirect rule, it doesn't matter. And that is what ignited both the Palestinian anti-colonialist movement and also the solidarity movement with the Palestinians. So the Israeli explanation for the lack of legitimacy does not withstand the historical truth. The historical truth is that Palestinians, when the first Jewish settlers arrived in Palestine in 1882, most of the Palestinians did not think that this was something that constituted an existential danger for them. They thought these were poor Europeans that Europe didn't want, and they were willing to host them. Palestinians' hospitality was quite famous at the time, not only Palestinian. I mean, the Middle East as a whole is much more hospitable to people who come from the outside than many other parts of the world. But the moment that these, people who were salvaged in many ways by Palestine began to talk about the Palestinians as aliens who usurped their own ancient homeland and began to plan and later activate ideas of how to dispossess the Palestinians. Of course, this was not even a matter of legitimacy or not. This was an existential matter for the Palestinians, still is an existential matter for the Palestinians. So ironically, the problem with Israel is that it constitutes an existential danger for the Palestinians. I mean, I've been saying it. I was not the only one. I've been saying it for 40 years and people looked at me as a lunatic. But I hope now in the last 2 years that this doesn't seem totally unfounded to say that the Palestinians are facing an existential danger. And all the time, the West said, no, Israel faces an existential danger. From whom? From the people who were expelled, from the people who were massacred, from the people who were genocide. I mean, you will talk to someone from another planet. I suppose it would be very difficult to understand how come this whole narrative is so much upside down and still regarded as truthful and valid. So I think that is the conundrum has to do a lot with educated, well-versed people lying, fabricating the truth for their own interests. So it's not ignorance, it's intentional ignorance or denialism, if you want.
It's interesting you're talking about the narrative. So it could be the fear of the other side providing their own narrative to debunk that Zionist narrative as well. I mean, because you mentioned the function of the lobby was never to actually pay attention to the Palestinians' narrative. It was just focused on promoting Israel there. I really want to dig deeper into that because in the context of, repressive behavior around academic institutions, I want to get your thoughts on, these campaigns of silencing criticism of Israel and Zionism on university campuses. We have our own share of that here in Australian campuses. I mean, this has even started, during Biden's administration. It's not really a Trump era kind of thing. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the campaign it weaponizes anti-Semitism, lately even Holocaust denial, in order to silence criticism on Israel or the attempt to give a proper historical context with for the present phase of violence in Israel and Palestine is part of what I describe in the book of the lobbying. I mean, it's part of the lobbying effort is to try and demolish any counter narrative, especially because this counter narrative is far more authentic, much more logical and sensible, and might win over people because it's so close to the truth compared to the propaganda that Israel kind of conveys. So I think that this kind of campaign is not based by university managements having serious discussion whose narrative is correct, or even having a serious discussion is support for the Palestinian struggle really support for terrorism or a manifestation of anti-Semitism. We can prove it empirically that none of those decisions taken by university management to frame criticism of Israel or Zionism as anti-Semitism, terrorism, or Holocaust denial, none of these decisions were the fruit of a serious discussion with people who know the history of Palestine, know the history of anti-Semitism, know the history of terrorism. Not even one meeting was devoted to it. What we have here is university management bowing to political elite security services who themselves haven't done this research either, who just decided for electoral reasons and for other agendas that have a lot to do with discomfort with too much democracy in their own countries, that for these kinds of reasons, it's best to accept unconditionally the Israeli demand to frame any criticism of Israel and Zionism as anti-Semitism, terrorism, or a Holocaust denial. This is quite incredible. I can give you one example. Some of us who are really experts on Palestinian history in Britain, non-experts, the British academia recognizes us as good historians, good scholars. It's not that we are self-advocating ourselves, self-advertising ourselves. And we try to find out who in the British government decided, for example, to proscribe the Hamas as a terrorist organization. first of all, we asked, did you consult anyone who is an expert on Palestinian liberation movement, even on the Hamas itself, or political Islam, you know, the phenomenon of political Islam, not just in Palestine, in the Arab world. Of course, not one person was consulted. What they did, they got the instruction from Israel and they accepted without condition, and probably because it fitted Islamophobic ideas there, racism there, and also, you know, security services are also very, very happy when they have an opportunity to curb freedom of expression and opinion, not just on Palestine. You know, we've seen it after 2001, after 9/11. They were very happy to renew all kinds of emergency regulations in the name of national security. And this is recent in the 21st century that is always fused with Islamophobia as well, and racism. So that's where we are, I think, here in this respect. And we're very disappointed when it also reaches the universities, but I think we tend to forget that universities are two different things nowadays. It's a management that runs an institution, and therefore it is run like a usual corporation with all the features of corporation. And it is also a community of scholars. But unfortunately, the community of scholars don't have enough influence on the institution's policies, partly because they are cowards, and partly because they're really in danger of losing the job and being suspended. But the two are connected, of course. You need some moral courage to deal with it. But that's why you are in Australia and we in Britain, we are facing this incredible phenomenon that even professors with tenure are afraid to challenge an institutional policy that is not based on their own knowledge, that in fact degrades their own scholarship, but they go along with it for fear for their own career and position.
So how different is lobbying within the academic institution from lobbying governments, for example? Does the lobbying organizations here in Australia and APAC, for example, use different tactics?
Yes, they do, I think, because the picture is not that grim from our perspective, those of us who show solidarity with the Palestinians. They are losing their ability to really tame first of all, the students. They suddenly realize that the students are also part of universities. I don't think they expected the students to be such a formative force in the last 2 years. It really surprised them. And of course, they're using all they can to do that. And because the students were so active, I think it encouraged at least a much larger number of academics to join in. It was not academics starting it and then the student joining. It was the other way around. By the way, in many of these revolutions, like in 1968, the Vietnam War, it was the same trajectory. And the difference is that when it comes to politicians, the lobby can use more easily its tactics of intimidation, of bribery, and I'm not talking only on financial bribery, you know, all kinds of other briberies, the threat of not to support you in your next re-election. They find it more difficult because universities, as a community of scholars, is part of civil society, not part of the elite. And it's much more difficult to intimidate civil society than to intimidate political and financial elites. So that they are trying to use very extreme means, and I'm optimistic about the failure for one reason. They cannot do it without totally undermining the basic ideas of freedom of expression, freedom of research, and freedom of opinion in universities. Now, if they succeed in totally eliminating these freedoms, there's no point of having university. So I do think that luckily for us, although they focused on Palestine, they are using a huge cannon, you know, for a small target, but it will have collateral damage, so to speak. And I think this is the difference. I think that the lobby, I also say it towards the end of my book, it will be still effective vis-a-vis political elites. I think it becomes less and less effective towards civil society, and definitely towards certain sections in civil society, which should give hopes those of us in civil societies who are engaged in solidarity, that even if we still feel, and rightly so, we have not managed to achieve what we want to achieve, and that is force the political elites to change their policies, we are in a much better position than we were 10 or 20 years ago. And that's one of the reasons that the measures used against us are far more lethal and far more extreme than they were 20 or 30 years.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, thank you for that, because it gives us hope that we are actually, our work is actually making an impact. Nonetheless, slow, but we are making an impact. Professor Ilan, I want to circle back to the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the Nakba. How does the current genocide in Gaza that we're witnessing day in and day out for the past 20 months, how does it relate or differ, from the 1948 Nakba? I mean, someone was asked me a while back, what are the similarities between the ethnic cleansing tactics used during the Nakba 1948 versus now, and how does the Israeli army right now differ from those, its roots, so to speak, the Zionist gangs and so on and so forth. I mean, the world, as you say, I think you mentioned that in your book, the world has accepted the Nakba 1948, largely because of the influence of the Zionist lobby worldwide. Are we seeing a similar patterns forming now?
Well, first of all, the Palestinians have a term in Arabic which I think helps to understand the connection between 1948 and today, which is the ongoing Nakba al-Mustamira. So in a way, they don't distinguish between the catastrophe Zionism imposed on them, inflicted upon them in 1948, and which Israel inflicts on them today, because it's part of the same plan, or the DNA, if you want, of a settler colonial project such as Zionism, to try and eliminate the indigenous native people of Palestine. And in 1948, it was done through ethnic cleansing, and we can definitely say now without hesitation, unfortunately, that in the last 20 months, it is done also through genocide, not just through ethnic cleansing. So I think that there are two differences between these two chapters, although, as I say, I think that those who talk about the ongoing Nakba are right to say that this is a structure, this is something you have to analyze together. You cannot sort of say these are two separate events. In many ways, what you have here is an Israeli political and military elite that believes it has an historical opportunity to complete what it has not completed in 48, because in 48, it only expelled half of the Palestinian population. It took over only 80% of historical Palestine. So now they have the whole of historical Palestine under their control, but they still are faced with what they would call the demographic problem of too many Palestinians within what they would like to see as the greater purist Jewish state. But the two differences are the following. I think that the Israeli commanders, officials, and so on in 1948 believed that they had the power to remove the Palestinians mainly by massive expulsions rather than by, genocidal policies as such. There were a lot of massacres in 1948 because ethnic cleansing usually is accompanied by massacres because people reject the forceful attempt to uproot them. And that's when the massacres occur. But they were not, as much as these distinctions are not a nice issue to deal with, but they were not meant to eliminate physically the Palestinian in the same way that it is done in Gaza. But I think you're asking, towards the end of your question, you ask even a more important question, because after all, if you are a victim to a massacre in Deir Yassim or a massacre in Beth Hanun, you are a victim of massacre, whether the scholar later would say that guy was, you know, a victim of ethnic cleansing and the other person was a victim of genocide. From the victim's point of view, these are not that relevant, I'm afraid, frameworks to discuss. But I think the last bit of your question is more important, maybe in this respect, and this is the international response. One cannot justify, but one can at least understand better the silence in 1948. After all, this was 3 years after the Second World War, where there was massive depopulation and transfer of people. You know, millions of people were moving and being uprooted around. Secondly, there was no television, no internet. News traveled in a much slower pace than they do today. And again, this is not justification. What I'm doing here is an explanation. You had a West that decided that turning a blind eye to the suffering of the Palestinians does not only enable to establish a Jewish state, something that there was another part of the deal that people are not aware of, would enable the West to convince the new state of Israel to lead the way to legitimize Germany, at that time Western Germany, as a major ally of the West in the Cold War. You needed the Jewish state to come and say, we are representing the Holocaust survivors, and even if Germany was not denazified in 1948, and it was not denazified in 1948, that is Western Germany, if the Jewish state recognizes it as a new Germany, then the West can have a very important ally in the Cold War. So we have to remember these historical circumstances. None of this can even serve as an explanation, let alone justification, cannot serve as an explanation for what we have seen in the last 20 months. I must say, I'm still, as much as I'm trying to explain it, I'm still finding it bewildering. That given the fact that the genocide is daily screened, you know, knowledge is there. I mean, there's no point to mention to you or to our viewer. I mean, they are fully aware that this is the most televised and documented genocide in human history. So all these ideas before 48 are not relevant really for the indifference. My explanation is for me is very disappointing when I'm trying to articulate it, but I think it has a lot to do with it. This is not only the power of the lobby, it's still the power of the lobby, undoubtedly. But I discovered something else in the last 20 months. I think that we tend to forget the kind of politicians we have today in the West. And that, I'm afraid to say, includes Australia. I hope nobody would be offended by this. Very low caliber of politicians. These are self-centered people. I'm generalizing. I'm sure here and there you have good, decent people. But all in all, people in the West who are deciding to be politicians, most of them. First of all, it's a career. It's not a wish to work for the society. It's a career. It's a very good career, by the way. A lot of financial dividends, a good salary, good pension. You have to remember this. It's an occupational solution to many people. And that means that they are interested in being re-elected rather than dealing with issues, definitely moral complex issues like Palestine. They are really distancing themselves from it. So it's not just the lobby, it is the ease with which the lobby can galvanize them because of the essence of politics, because of their low caliber in terms of their moral constitution, their system value, their regard for the real concerns of their society. It's not just about Palestine. It would be the same about ecological justice, about social justice, economic justice. Gaza just brings to the fore how terrible is this moral indifference and lack of moral constitution, but it affects also other parts of it. And in a way, only when the essence of politics would change, we will have a far better global alliance that could help the Palestinians in their struggle for liberation and freedom.
Very well said. I mean, all these corrupt system, they coalesce, and Gaza is kind of holding a mirror in front of all these systems for us. And thank you for that analysis. Really great insight. So I do want to encourage everyone to start putting their questions in the Q&A. We'll get to them in a couple of questions. I do want to encourage everyone who's putting a question to put a brief question with a question mark at the end, because I won't be able to read an essay before I get to the question. Thank you. So I want to go back to the beginnings of this genocide, or the situation that we found ourselves in. You know, what is the historic significance of October the 7th offensive, particularly on the future of the Palestinian national movement? And also, you mentioned in a number of essays that you wrote that Zionism is in the downfall. So what is the impact of October 7th on the Zionist movement as well as a whole?
Yeah. I like to compare the 7th of October and everything that happened, not just on that day, you know, everything that happened after that, to an earthquake that shook seriously a house that already had serious cracks in its foundations. So it was already a shaky house. But this particular earthquake, if you want, widened the cracks in the foundation to such a degree that we can begin to talk about its potential, more than potential. It's quite, I would say, assured collapse in the future, without knowing when it will happen, but we can say that it accelerated and intensified processes that already occurred or began to occur before the 7th of October. For instance, before the 7th of October, there was already a social implosion within the Israeli Jewish society. It seemed that without any relevance to the Palestinians themselves, the idea that Judaism is nationalism and not a religion is not holding water. It's not working. It's not working. So even if most of the Jews in Israel are for an apartheid Israel, and most of them are for apartheid Israel, even those who define themselves as liberals or socialists, nonetheless, they don't agree on what kind of an apartheid Jewish state it will be. And at times they thought that an enemy from without, an enemy from within would help them to gloss over the two different ideas of how does a state look like if it defines itself as a Jewish state. Now, long before the 7th of October, it was clear that they have totally, contradictory ideas of what it means, to the degree that they cannot find a common basis for that. And in November 2022, the more theocratic, messianic, religious, even religious is not a good enough term. I think it's far more theocratic, fundamentalist kind of version of Zionism, moved from the margins of Israeli society to the center. They became the force. They became the elites, not just political elites, financial elites, military elites, security elites. And they are not only a menace to the Palestinians because they believe that they have the power to create a greater Israel without any Palestinians in it. They're also a menace to those Jews who see themselves as liberal or secular. They see them, as one of the famous rabbis of them said, they are the Messiah's donkey, namely, they fulfill their role in history, and either they will understand and behave as we ask them to behave, or we don't need them, you know? And this is translated into violence in the streets, violence in language, and so on. So that's one process. Now, what did the 7th of October do? It proved that even a formidable attack on Israel's security, that you would have thought maybe bring these two camps together, was not enough to cement the two camps. So it not only that it did not stop the implosion, it increased the implosion. The same thing Netanyahu is hoping now that the war against Iran would do the same, and it won't work. The fundamental issue here is far more important or far stronger than all the attempts to distract from it. Another issue which is very important is the isolation of Israel. It did not begin on the 7th of October. Millions of people in the world, not governments, that is true, but millions of people in the world compared to 30 or 40 years ago, regard Israel as a pariah state, as a rogue state. They don't want at best, they don't want anything to do with it. And at worst, from Israel's perspective, they're very active in demanding from their government to impose sanctions and to translate their ideas into active policy. And the third process is what happened to the Jewish community, the younger Jewish communities in the world, including the United States, dissociate themselves from Zionism. And part of their way to manifest that disassociation from Zionism is to join the Palestinian solidarity movement. There are economic issues. There are issues. The military is, the Israeli military is something that is very kind of mesmerizes a lot of strategic experts in the world, and is defined as a really formidable, invincible force because of the Air Force. Yes, it has a very powerful Air Force, but it is unable to fight guerrilla movements, whether they are in Jenin, in Gaza, or in Lebanon. And eventually, you can use, of course, the Israelis are using the Air Force in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as well, but we know that this is not a military strategy that works. So there is also a question of military invincibility that is questioned. And all of that connects also, and this is my last point, to the question, is there still a Palestinian liberation movement? Is there still a Palestinian national movement? What Israelis, and I'm generalizing here about political elites, academic elites, strategic elites, with their allies in the West said, well, anyway, we have nothing to worry about that. Totally, the Palestinian polity is totally disunited, disempowered, disenfranchised, and so on. Well, not only Gaza proved that this is not true, the younger Palestinian generation in historical Palestine and worldwide conveys much more a message of unity than the present political elite, a much clearer vision for the future, a different kind of determination and resolve compared to the present political, or those who define themselves as the present political Palestinian elite. And that's another process. Now, all these processes, by the way, by themselves cannot bring down a region, not by themselves. But what we know from history that they tend to converge eventually. And then it becomes both a very powerful transformative moment and a very quick transformative moment. Suddenly, the whole pace accelerates. We saw it with the fall of South Vietnam. We saw it with the fall of the French rule in Algeria. We saw it with changes in the former Soviet Union, apartheid in South Africa, dictatorial regimes in South America. There is a moment where it comes together, and then it's very quick in terms of historical change.
We can also only hope that this will be happening soon. Thank you so much for that fantastic insight. And I do want to pick up on that thread and continue on it, because this is a really important issue when it comes to what's the vision for the future for both sides. The question is there another resolution for the Palestinian struggle beyond, the prevalent proposed two-state, one-state dichotomy? You wrote a book with Ramzi Baroud, I think, Our Vision of Liberation. I think I remember that book. So what is the possible vision for liberation and decolonization in historic Palestine from the river to the sea? Does Zionism feature in that future?
Well, the short answer is no, but it deserves an elaboration. First of all, I think that we are all aware that at this moment in time, talking about a shared vision of the colonizer with the colonized in a decolonized Palestine is not a very good moment in history. I mean, you talk to people in Gaza, you talk to people in the West Bank, even to Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, who usually are far more inclined to see a joint future because they have a different kind of relationship with the Israeli Jews. They don't see them only as settlers and soldiers. Even among them, there's a sense, let's not talk about it now, let's talk about survival. Let's talk about existence because we are under existential danger. But of course, people also realize that the strategic thinking, the visionary effort should continue even at a time like this. But I wanted to just put it in perspective of timing. So I'm not surprised that there's less of a conversation about it than there was before the 7th of October. But I believe this conversation will return. So I'm part of a movement which is called the One Democratic State Initiative. This is not a movement that has a resolution for all the issues of the future. It doesn't want to offer such a resolution because we are only representing ourselves, and we believe in the right of movements to represent themselves authentically and decide about the future. What it does, it actually stresses few principles that I think can lead to some sort of answer to your question. The first one is very, very important. People tend to forget that in the so-called peace process, whether it was a genuine peace process, whether it was a cynical peace process, the Palestinians were never in the driver's seat. They were always asked to respond to ideas of peace that were prepared in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, or Washington, or Oslo, to be more accurate historically. And so first of all, this has to start with an internal Palestinian way of articulating a vision through maybe new or renewed institutions that are representative and something that I'm sure will happen. So I think that's a very important issue. That doesn't mean that activists and academics like myself and many of our friends should not continue to deal with this vision and unpack it. But I think at the back of our mind, we should remember it has to be a Palestinian process of decolonization that will have to include a reference to the fact that there are 8 million Jews in historical Palestine today. And you cannot ignore, you cannot say like, well, they will disappear, so it will be okay. No, they will not disappear. Part of your vision definitely will include reference to their place in decolonized Palestine. But as I say, we are human beings and our imagination works, our ambition, our aspiration work. And therefore, I think if we produce it and translate it into articles, ideas, webinars, and so on, it will be helpful. It will be helpful also for the liberation movement itself to deal with it. So from that perspective, what I'm thinking of, and that's the second principle we have in our initiative, which I think is very important. We say that if you look for positive scenarios in the future, don't go and shop in the European supermarkets of ideas and solutions. They don't have anything to offer. You tried it. The two-state solution is a product from the European supermarket of ideas. There is a legacy, there is a heritage before 1948 of an Eastern Mediterranean. There was a mosaic of identities, of genuine live and let live, genuine coexistence. Now, of course, you cannot in history take a period and implement it in the future, but it can be inspired by this. And that inspiration is important because it offers a definition of the Jews in the decolonized Palestine that is totally an antidote to Zionism, which includes the Jews as it would include the Maronite, the Yazidis, anyone who insists that they are an ethnocultural group, and people are entitled to be part of an ethnocultural group if they feel that this is important for them, right? But ethnocultural groups usually in the especially the pre-First World War, reality were not a threat to anyone else. And it can be fused within a democratic state as well. But definitely Zionism does not allow for Jews to be such an ethnocultural a group. This, and of course, other principles are dear to many of us. We've looked at post-apartheid South Africa, and we lament the fact that the economic apartheid continues. We don't want to be there, you know. So we are also talking about social justice, economic justice. We are also not in the business of inventing wheels that already exist. For instance, transitional justice is already there. I mean, if you talk about the right of return of the refugees, and how does this right of return comply with the presence of people already on other people's homeland, houses, and so on? There are so many mechanisms in transitional justice that can help solve these issues. So I think it's a vision that is not romantic in the sense that nobody promises it would be easy. Nobody says it won't have teasing problems. Nobody says that decolonization is a very nice walk in the park. Hopefully it would be as less violent as possible, but history does not give us a lot of decolonization processes that were totally non-violent. But we should aspire for it, of course. But in the end of the day, it cherishes, first of all, the principle of equality between people, which is totally absent from any peace solution that was presented to the Palestinians since the Balfour Declaration until today. It includes the recognition that Palestine is part of the Arab world, which is again something all the peace processes totally ignored, and that it will strive to respect human rights, civil rights, and collective rights as part of the effort of the whole area around Palestine to build a society that can, remove the kind of regimes and suffering that not only people in Palestine suffered from, in order to build a much better world for all of us.
Well said, and I agree that the journey to that end won't be an easy one. I can only quote Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizer. He said, two-state solution is too late, and one state is probably too soon. There's a genocide going on at the moment. Yeah, on that note, I want to go to the Q&A questions from the audience. There's a question here that says, I read that you mentioned this organization that you're part of, Professor Ilan, pursuing one-state solution. So someone is asking, I read that you formed an organization inside Israel, an organization to help the Palestinian refugees return. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, but that's something different. Well, people like me have more than one initiative.
I'm sure that's the case.
No, I'm part of several initiatives which are doing two things. Trying to protect the memory of the Nakba, because there's still huge denial of the Nakba 48. So I created with others a charity called the Nakba Memorial Foundation that operates all over the world in order to fight this denialism. We think it's very important to make sure that there are not only centers against Holocaust denial, but that there should be centers against Nakba denial. And secondly, we believe that one of the important ways of doing it is, of course, to work for the return of the refugees. So the one-state initiative I talked about has a very clear stance in unconditional support for the right of the Palestinian refugees to return. But I'm also connected to initiatives that try to educate the Jewish community in Israel about the right of return, called Zochrot. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, which is remembering in Hebrew. The Committee for the Displaced Persons Rights within the Palestinian community in Israel, Lajnat al-Muhajirin, as it's called in Arabic. These are the people who are internal Palestinian refugees inside Israel. We have about 300,000 Palestinians who are citizens of Israel who actually are refugees in their own country, living very close to Jewish settlements that were built on their villages and neighborhoods and so on. So we are involved there. And as a director of the academic center, the European Center for Palestinian Studies in my own university, University of Exeter, together with other centers, we are building models and ideas and practical ideas how return would look like. We don't want to leave it as a slogan. We want to show that this is a possible, that not only it's legitimate under the international law and unconditioned, and the main precondition for any kind of reconciliation in the future, but there is a way of talking about it in practical terms. How does it look like? Because all the facts are there, you know, and I would like to mention in this respect my dear friend Salman Abu Sitta, who has a great project in which he shows quite clearly how, for example, return can be achieved with very little removal of the present residents, Jewish residents in places where Palestinians used to live. It's worth looking at his project. So all of this, yes, I'm part of it, because I do believe that we cannot remain in the realm of slogans and sound bites. As academics, we should contribute to show people that it's not only legally and morally a valid project, but it's also a practical one and a possible one. I think it's very important to make sure that people understand it, because definitely decolonization, reconciliation would include massive return of refugees. Maybe not all of them would like to return, which is fine, but I'm sure that a lot of them would like to close this chapter in their life, even if they are a second or third generation of people who were expelled in 1948, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who had been expelled since 1967, who definitely would want to return.
Couldn't agree more. And we had a conversation with Dr. Salman Abu Sitta a while back, and we talked about his project, and hopefully we'll have him again sometime next month to dig more into these projects. As you mentioned, the key word is practice. It is practical, and we need to internalize that at some point. The next question is, Hanan is asking, Professor Ilan, when will the genocide of Palestinians end, especially with the extremist groups government of Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben Gvir being supported by, you know, the ES, the US administration?
Yes, I wish I had some fantastic news about it, which I don't have to be realistic and responsible. I think that part, as I mentioned in the very beginning of our conversation, part of the reason Netanyahu chose that timing to attack Iran was that there was the beginning of a change among the political elites in the West about the genocide that could have accelerated the efforts to end it. I don't know when it will end. I hope as soon as possible. It's, you know, what the Israelis are now doing on a daily basis, which is massively killing people standing on the line waiting for food and medicine, is even, if you can say, it's even more barbaric than anything they've done before, and what they've done before is horrific. You hope that this, I don't know, escalation of inhumanity would escalate the action against it. We have to believe, those of us, and I know so many of us are doing what we can through petitions, demonstrations, manifestations of solidarity in our campuses and so on. If it's not working, we are doing what we can, but maybe we're not doing enough. Maybe we should think about other, you know, out of the box ideas, because we are not a small number of people. You know, it's millions and millions of people in the world. So I'm not criticizing anyone. I'm always criticizing only myself, and I'm trying to think. And I know that there are new initiatives. I hope that they will take place. You know, let me just mention two of them, which I think are important. There is the Gaza Tribunal, with Richard Falk has initiated, which I'm part of, which I think is a brilliant idea to put pressure by the most important people in international law on the ICJ and ICC to do much more than they're doing, because I think that that could be an important way of stopping the genocide. So that's one initiative that wasn't there before. There is the Oslo conversation that the fantastic Dr. Mads Gilbert has initiated, trying to and succeeding in convincing politicians and especially former foreign ministers and so on to change the conversation of Europe from serving as mediators of peace to being the defenders of the Palestinians. Now, all of them have not yet stopped, but I think these are positive signs that people keep thinking and again and again of what to do. I do believe that it will succeed, but believe is one thing, and praying for it to end soon is another thing. But I think we are all involved in trying to make our voice more effective, as much as we have done some good work until now.
100%. I mean, we need to keep coming up with these great ideas and initiatives. Eventually, I mean, like Professor Neve Gordon mentioned, he said, you never know when that straw that will break the camel's back will happen. That moment, I mean, as long as we keep pressuring, keep educating the public, working on the public opinion, it's really, really important work and timely as well. The next question was which is really interesting question. It says some international relations scholars argue that we're entering a multipolar era, one in which the US global dominance is declining and power is increasingly dispersed among regional blocs and rising states. Given that Israel's impunity has long depended on unconditional US support, military, diplomatic, and economic, and so on and so forth, what do you think a truly multipolar world would mean for Israel?
I'm familiar with this vision. I hope I don't disappoint anyone. I'm less, for me, this is not what I'm looking for. I mean, I'm definitely looking for a world in which American involvement is decreased. Especially, I'm looking for a future in which American involvement in the Middle East is decreased. That's for sure. And that's one thing multipolar world would achieve. So that would be positive. However, if you think about what countries such as India or China or Russia would bring to the fore, look at their policies, look at their interests. It's not about going all the way to support the Palestinian liberation and totally change the international context in which the balance on the ground is working. No, I'm far more interested, and I think this could happen, in something we talked in our conversation about it, in changing the essence of politics, not just in terms of states as being actors, but we as human societies being actors. We have an unbearable situation where, whether in democracies or non-democracies, our basic concerns and interests, which include also an interest on what our government should do in places such as Gaza, are not at all reflected in the policies of our politicians. And that is something we in history, people were able to revolutionize this situation. And I think that's for me the future of liberation, the future of making politicians, even if it's a cynical thing, to believe that from an electoral point of view, it's not good to support Israel. Mm. That is for me far more important than people who are saying to me, oh, you know, if China and India would be involved in Palestine, it would be better for the liberation. I'm not so sure about it. I mean, if at all, I'm looking for involvement of powers in the international issue, I'm looking for the global south, for countries, progressive countries in Latin America, like Colombia, like Brazil. I'm looking for South Africa, definitely involvement. I would love to see Malaysia and Indonesia taking a more keen interest in what's happening in Palestine, being as it is part of the Muslim world, and so on. So yes, you need also some countries in the global south to be part of this transformation. But the most important transformation is not, I don't think it's in the level of states. It's in the realm of the relationship between societies and politics, which right now is not a good relationship. And surprisingly, maybe, or not surprisingly, also in countries that define themselves as democracy.
I mean, to that end, you just a couple of weeks ago, you attended this anti-Zionist Jewish Congress in Vienna, which was really exciting. We had Roni Barkan speaking about it and promoting it here in Australia. I'm not sure how many people from Australia actually attended, but can you speak a little bit about that? And more generally, Professor Ilan, can you talk about the role of anti-Zionist movements around the world in promoting Palestinian rights?
Yeah, there was a very important conference. It was the first time that Jews who are active in the solidarity movement with Palestine decided to try and institutionalize the networking. Because in some places, Jews who are anti-Zionists are very alone. In some places, they are quite a formidable force to reckon with. And the idea was to have a network of solidarity in order to maximize what we can do for the Palestinians. This is not, as Radha Karmi said, and I think she was absolutely right, this is not an issue that the Palestinians should be concerned with, rightly so. This is not a Palestinian issue. This is an issue for us as Jews when our religion, our identity is used in our name to colonize, to dispossess, to genocide. That's what we are, first of all, interested in, to say not in our name, not in our name. Secondly, we recognize, whether it's just or not just, that Jewish voices can be, unfortunately, sound more legitimate in some places because of Islamophobia and so on. I think this is an attempt to find the best way to dissociate the question of Judaism from the project of elimination of the Palestinians. Because as we know, and we talked about in our conversation, Israel weaponizes anti-Semitism in order to silence and weaken the solidarity movement with the Palestinians. I think the more we will be able to say, this has nothing to do with Judaism, this has nothing to do with Jews, it has to do with Zionists, with a certain ideology, with a certain interpretation of that ideology right now, then I think it would be easier to expose it for what it is and maybe expand the solidarity movement with the Palestinians beyond its present boundaries. It's much easier to do it today than it was, 30 years ago. It's a very positive sign that we had to turn down some people who wanted to come because there was not enough place for them. I think this is a growing movement. It also sends a message, I think, to the Israeli Jews. There's a way to be a Jew, even in historical Palestine, without being a Zionist, that is not just, and that's the most important thing, would end the oppression of the Palestinians, but would also liberate the Jews of historical Palestine from their own prison and cage, and offers them even a better a future as human beings and people, if they do see still themselves as Jews and so on. So I think it's a very important conversation that it begins, but it should be understood where it is without making it something that overshadows the solidarity movement with the Palestinians. And of course, the key word here is solidarity. Sometimes in the 70s and the 80s, people who, with good intention, kept telling the Palestinians what they should do. That's not solidarity. I think we are getting to a much better understanding of solidarity as Jews and non-Jews. which I think would, again, these are long-term processes, and we want to stop the genocide, but in the long term, this would be a very helpful development.
Well said. I couldn't agree more. I mean, and it's a good point about the solidarity, because at the beginning of the genocide, I did used to hear a lot of people saying, we need to see more secular organizations in the Palestinian movement. We need this, we need that. And one can't help but wondering, who are you again? You're not a Palestinian, and so on. So it's really, really a good point. The next question is, if part of the reason to create Israel was for the West to have an ally in the Middle East, has the creation of Israel been a failed strategy? Has Israel only heightened conflict around the world?
I think the simple answer is yes. I don't know if around the world, I wouldn't be that ambitious in this analysis, but definitely in the Middle East. It alienated many people in the Middle East from the West. It undermined Western interests. Even, I think, the mass immigration that you have seen from the Middle East into Europe and into the West was a result of the existence of regimes that could not be challenged properly either by the West or from people inside because of the exceptionalism that Israel enjoyed. So I think that this idea that you have an ally is born within an Orientalist mindset. The Orientalist mindset said is the one that is connected to the clash of civilization. Namely, Europe is the enlightened, progressive civilization. The Arab one is exactly the opposite, and you need a bastion. You need a kind of your own agents in it to protect your values, what they sometimes like to call the Judeo-Christian civilization. This institutionalized racism, perpetuated racism, contributed to the destabilization of political systems in the area, to mass immigration, to economic crises, and so on. It's not that liberated Palestine or the creation of a more democratic regime between the river and the sea tomorrow solves all the problems of the Arab world. It's not. We're not claiming that at any given moment. What we are saying that it creates conducive circumstances to finally deal properly with all these issues. And you know that I would give an example which I think it shows you why I'm a bit desperate about the ability of our politicians to deal with complex issues, because complex issues may risk their re-election. Iran and Israel is a very good example. Iran is not a country that respects human rights and civil rights. But Iran is also one of the few countries in the Middle East that showed support for the Palestinians when the rest of the Arab world was standing in the queue to normalize the colonization of Palestine. It's complex. Absolutely, it's complex. But you can, if you are putting your mind to it, see the distinction between a long struggle for improvement of human rights and civil rights on the one hand, and a struggle to stop an elimination of a people. It's not the same thing. You also have to see the connection between the two. You have to see the connection. And you can see that you have offered so much help to Israel, not surprisingly, the Palestinians, because they are under a genuine danger of elimination and clinging to anyone who is willing to help them. They don't have the luxury to look at the human rights records when they are about to be eliminated. All these needs a complex perspective. To my mind, not that complex, but it's incredible. And one best proof to what I'm saying is that if tomorrow a secular regime takes over Iran, but normalizes a relationship with Israel and continues to oppress the Iranian people, it would be the blue-eyed boy of the West. The West would have no problem with it. The main yardstick in the West for whether to condemn human rights abuses in the Middle East is the position of those countries towards Israel.
But it's the population that keeps coming back and resisting that, imperialism. It's always been like that. I mean,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. So the next question is, how do we, that's a really good, relevant question as well. How do we teach as academics in this moment? It's an interesting question. How do we subvert the oppressive environments we teach in to do something useful in classrooms, talking openly, freedom of speech and academic freedom and so on and so forth, given these silencing forces?
Yeah. Well, it's very clear that in some places, our official program is censored to the degree that either we can not teach or research the themes we want to teach, or our way of teaching it is challenged. So there are certain things we can do. First of all, we can be connected to international networking that allows us to listen at least and to participate in such conversations where there are more, it's safer to have them. I'll give you an example. I created with others a very safe space in the University of Exeter called the Center for Palestine Studies, where we openly discuss issues that probably in the University of London you cannot do. So people come to us virtually or come to us physically. I think it's very important to have this international kind of envelope that allows you formally or informally, if needed be, to be loyal to the way you think Palestine should be researched, studied, and talked about within the academic framework. I think that it's beginning to work, whether it's students teach in webinars, which I do a lot, whether it is international webinars that have the same authority in terms of the people who participate in it, even if it doesn't get you the credits for a degree and so on. I think in this respect, it's much better. We're in a better position than we were before. I do suggest not doing it alone, not doing it if you are in a vulnerable position in your own academic institution. There's no point in it. To seek the people who have a stronger position in the academic institution and hope that they are willing to chip in. And as I say, be a part of that international. I can give you an example from Germany, which is the worst situation in Europe is in Germany in terms of not allowing academics and students to talk freely about Palestine. So what they do, they first of all invite people like myself to give the talks, or we have workshops with them on the internet so that they can talk freely, if not in their own classroom, in their own university halls, at least in the cyberspace. So this should be continue to be challenged and worked out.
Absolutely. And like you mentioned at the beginning, people will need to get creative as well, promoting new ideas on how to sustain that movement. I don't want to take too much time of your time, Professor Ilan. I might just end with a couple of questions and then we can end with just a small questions. This is a common question, and then you actually wrote a book about, debunking Zionist propaganda. So what do you think the best way to debunk Zionist propaganda in everyday's, conversation?
I think we are lucky that what was once considered an opinion, that is, you're supporting the Palestinian narrative and that's your opinion, is now fully substantiated by proper research. So I think that when it comes to facts on the ground and the truth about history, it easily challenges today most of the myths that Israel is propagating. And a lot of scholars, good scholars in their field, have already done it. So I think nowadays we are lucky. There's a huge reservoir that can really be used for any of the basic myths that one feels are providing immunity for the genocide or for other forms of oppression of the Palestinians.
Well said. Thank you so much for that. My last question to you, Professor Ilan Pappe. We've been demonstrating, we've been petitioning, we've been writing emails, we've been doing film screenings, educating the public. What more effective measures can, the civil society and policymaker take, based on our pressure to stop the genocide and more importantly, to combat Zionism and promote Palestinian rights? Can you give us hints? How do we continue struggling for Palestine?
Well, I think most of us are doing the right thing already. I mean, I wouldn't sit here and say that people are not doing what they can. I think it's important to watch out for these processes on which you have no control. That might also help to change the reality on the ground. That's the first point. The second point, I think we probably are sometimes too purist in our attempt to form coalitions that would help us to put pressure on governments, change public opinion, perceptions, and so on. This was the main failure of the solidarity movements with the Palestinians in the 1970s and the 1980s. If you were not part of the left, you were not part of the solidarity movement. I think we should be more pragmatic in the way that we expand the alliance. I will give you an example. Like so many of us, I was moved by the fact that 1 million people came to demonstrate in London when the genocide began. Now, these 1 million people did not share everything in terms of their interpretation of reality, their politics, their ideologies, but they were very united that they will do all they can to stop the genocide. Sometimes we are not able to renew that rainbow alliance that was there as a political force, because when you start to institutionalize that, people say, oh, but they are not secular enough, they are not interested in rights of other groups as we are. Now, all these are valid points for the future, but not for a moment of when the people who need your solidarity are under the danger of extermination. You don't have that luxury. The Palestinians don't have the luxury of your purism. And we need, I feel, and I say it as someone who's been at 50 years now, I don't always see pragmatism. People like to bask in their own, moral purity, and it comes at the expense of building a proper alliance that, yes, has internal conflicts on other issues, but not on what needs to be done for Palestine. It's not easy to do it, especially if you are a long-term activist within a certain ideological milieu, but it's not good enough to be stuck in that milieu. As I say, the Palestinians don't have the luxury for that kind of purism. And I think we are beginning. I can see I participated in so many international conferences on Palestine. I can see the change in the composition of people who come, and I'm very happy about it. I'm very happy about it. Yes, they reflect different perceptions of life, come from different communities, and that's good. That is very good. And they learn also to navigate and reconcile what can be which is reconcilable, because they remember what is important in the end.
Absolutely. This is probably the most excellent advice I've ever heard before, because forming alliances is really, really crucial. And I think we see that already in Australia, forming alliances with climate organizations, with anti-AUKUS organizations, anti-militarization organizations, First Nations, Indigenous communities. So these are really, really important and existentially important for the movement, the Palestinian movement. Professor Ilan Pappe, I couldn't possibly thank you enough for being with us today. Every time you speak, more questions pop up my head, but I'll probably keep it for another session. Maybe we can host you again at some point in the future, or maybe in person, if you're willing to travel all the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of you who attended the webinar, especially for you, Ahmed. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you, Professor. And for those, I want to remind everyone that the video recording of this session will be sent out in the next couple of days, and I'll send it to you as well, Professor Ilan, for your own benefit. And it will be available on our YouTube channel, Palestine Justice Movement. Please stay tuned for our next webinar with Dr. Reverend Stephen Sizer. That'll be on the 2nd of July. Thank you again, and have a great morning, Professor Ilan Pappe.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.